Admiral William Halsey stared at the contact report from his pilots. Japanese carriers, 4 of them, located 200 miles north of Luzon. It was October 24th, 1944. The largest naval battle in history was unfolding across 100,000 square miles of Philippine waters. Halsey had a decision to make. His Third Fleet was guarding San Bernardino Strait, the northern approach to Leyte Gulf, where 130,000 American soldiers were landing under MacArthur's command. A Japanese surface force had already been spotted approaching from the west. Battleships, heavy cruisers, the largest warships Japan had left. But carriers were the prize. Every admiral knew that. Carriers had won Midway. Carriers had turned the Pacific War. And now the Japanese were offering their last 4 flat tops on a platter. Halsey made his choice. He would take every ship north and destroy those carriers, every battleship, every cruiser, every destroyer, the entire Third Fleet. The strait would be left completely unguarded. The invasion force on the beaches would be naked to the enemy from the north. Halsey didn't know he was making a mistake that should have ended his career. He didn't know those carriers were empty. Decoys. Bait designed specifically to lure him away. And he didn't know that by morning, the men he left behind would be fighting battleships with destroyers. The Japanese called it Operation Show, Victory. It was their last chance to stop the American advance in the Philippines. The plan was audacious. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would take Japan's last 4 carriers north of Luzon and make himself visible to American scouts. His carriers were nearly useless. Only 108 aircraft between all 4 ships. Most of his experienced pilots had been killed at the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier. Ozawa's mission wasn't to fight. His mission was to die. He would sacrifice his carriers to lure the American fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Once Halsey took the bait, the real striking force would slip through unguarded. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded that striking force. 5 battleships, including the Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. Kurita would transit San Bernardino Strait at night, emerge on the eastern side of the Philippines, and fall on the American landing beaches at dawn. MacArthur's 130,000 men would be caught between Japanese guns and the Philippine jungle. The transports and supply ships would be destroyed. It was a suicide mission. But if Kurita reached the Gulf, the sacrifice would be worth it. Everything depended on one man taking the bait. Halsey had warnings. His intelligence officer practically begged him to reconsider. Commander Mike Cheek had studied Japanese tactics for years. When reports came in that Kurita's surface force was still advancing despite air attacks, Cheek went to Halsey's chief of staff. "They're coming through San Bernardino," Cheek insisted. He knew the Japanese. He'd played poker with them, he said. They were bluffing with those carriers. The chief of staff told Cheek that Halsey had been awake for 48 hours. The admiral had already overruled the last officer who disagreed with him. The discussion was over. That night, aircraft from USS Independence flew over San Bernardino Strait. They spotted navigation lights. Ships were transiting the passage. The pilots reported Japanese warships moving through the strait. Kurita's force was coming. Halsey dismissed the reports. He was convinced Kurita had been crippled by air attacks earlier that day. His pilots had sunk the super battleship Musashi and claimed hits on multiple other ships. The Japanese were retreating, Halsey believed. Those navigation lights meant nothing. At 8:22 p.m. on October 24th, Halsey ordered his entire fleet north. Every battleship, every carrier, every destroyer. The gate was left wide open. No picket ships, no submarines, nothing. And Kurita's battleships were already approaching the passage. The confusion began with a single message. At 3:12 p.m. on October 24th, Halsey had sent a dispatch announcing his battle plan. Task Force 34 will be formed, the message read. It described a powerful surface force of battleships and cruisers under Admiral Willis Lee that would engage any Japanese ships approaching San Bernardino. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet at Leyte Gulf, intercepted the message. So did Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Both men read it the same way. Task Force 34 had been formed. Lee's battleships were guarding the strait. They were wrong. Halsey had written the message as a contingency plan. What he would do if he needed to form a surface group. The key words were buried in naval jargon. 3 hours later, Halsey sent a clarification. Task Force 34 would only be formed if and when he directed it. The battleships were staying with him. But Halsey sent the clarification by voice radio only. The signal had limited range. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet never received it. Halsey never followed up. He never sent a telegraphic confirmation to Nimitz or Kinkaid. He never explicitly stated that San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. Kinkaid went to sleep that night, believing Lee's battleships were protecting his northern flank. Nimitz believed the same thing in Pearl Harbor. Neither man knew the strait was wide open. Neither man knew Kurita's force was about to pass through. The largest warships in the world were bearing down on men who didn't know they were coming. At 3 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Kurita's center force passed through San Bernardino Strait. 23 warships in a single column. No opposition. Kurita couldn't believe it. His officers had expected American battleships waiting to cross their T. They had expected submarines lurking at the choke point. They had expected aircraft overhead at first light. There was nothing. The strait was empty. And so Yamato led the way. 72,000 tons of armored steel, 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds over 25 miles. The most powerful warship ever built. Behind Yamato came the battleship Nagato, then the fast battleships Kongo and Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers bristling with 8-inch guns, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. By dawn, Kurita's force had cleared the strait and turned south toward Leyte Gulf. The American landing beaches were 60 miles away. MacArthur's supply ships and transports were sitting unprotected. Between Kurita and those beaches stood only one thing, a handful of escort carriers and destroyers that weren't supposed to fight battleships. They were designated Task Unit 77 4.3. The sailors called themselves Taffy 3. Their commander was about to receive the worst surprise of his life. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was drinking coffee on the bridge of his flagship Fanshawe Bay when the first report came in. It was 6:47 a.m. One of his pilots had spotted a Japanese surface force 20 miles northwest. Pagoda masts, battleships. Sprague thought it was a mistake. It had to be Halsey's Task Force 34. The pilot had misidentified friendly ships. Then the second report came in. Rising sun flags. These were Japanese warships. Sprague looked through his binoculars. Pagoda-style superstructures were visible on the horizon. Masts that belonged to battleships. Japanese battleships. For a moment, there was only silence on the bridge. The kind of silence that comes when men realize they are already dead. He felt the blood drain from his face. His task unit consisted of 6 escort carriers, small, slow ships, with thin hulls and a single 5-inch gun each. They were designed to provide air support for ground troops, not fight warships. His screen consisted of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, tin cans with 5-inch guns facing 18-inch naval rifles. Sprague did the math instantly. His fastest ship could make 18 knots. Yamato could make 27. He couldn't outrun them. His biggest guns were pop guns compared to Yamato's 18-inch rifles. He couldn't outfight them. At 6:58 a.m., the Japanese opened fire. Sprague watched in horror as colored geysers erupted around his ships, red, green, yellow, blue. The Japanese were using dye-loaded shells to help spot their fall of shot. Each ship used a different color. The splashes were beautiful and terrifying. The shells were the size of Volkswagens, and they were getting closer. Commander Ernest Evans didn't wait for orders. The moment Japanese shells started falling, he turned USS Johnston toward the enemy fleet and rang up flank speed. Evans was Cherokee and Creek, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma. When Johnston was commissioned a year earlier, he had told his crew exactly what kind of ship this would be. "This is going to be a fighting ship," Evans had said. "I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now he was proving it. Johnston charged alone toward 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers, 1 destroyer against 23 warships. Evans closed to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano and fired 10 torpedoes. At least 1 struck home. The explosion blew off Kumano's bow and knocked her out of the battle. Johnston had drawn blood, but now every Japanese gun was turning toward her. She shouldn't have lasted 5 minutes, but she wasn't fighting alone. The other destroyers followed Johnston into the attack. Hole and Herman charged the Japanese line. The tiny destroyer escorts joined them. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland commanded USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort half the size of a real destroyer. His ship had 2 5-inch guns facing battleships with 18-inch rifles. Copeland gathered his crew on the fantail before the attack. His words were simple and devastating. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds," he told them. "Survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Then Samuel B. Roberts charged a heavy cruiser at point-blank range. The Japanese cruiser Chokai couldn't depress her guns low enough to hit the tiny destroyer escort racing alongside her. Samuel B. Roberts pumped 5-inch shells into Chokai's superstructure at ranges where the crews could see each other's faces. For nearly an hour, the American destroyers and destroyer escorts performed the impossible. They laid smoke screens to hide the carriers. They made torpedo runs against ships 10 times their size. They drew fire that would have sunk the escort carriers in minutes. The Japanese formation broke apart in confusion. Kurita's carefully planned attack dissolved into a chaotic melee as his ships maneuvered to avoid torpedoes and engaged individual American destroyers. The tin cans were buying time, but the price was terrible. By 8 a.m., the battle had become a nightmare of smoke, shellfire, and dying ships. The American destroyers were being torn apart. USS Hole took over 40 hits. Her bridge was destroyed. Her engine rooms flooded. She went down with most of her crew still aboard. Samuel B. Roberts fought until her guns literally melted from overuse. A Japanese battleship finally landed a direct hit that broke her back. She sank at 9:35 a.m. 90 men died. On Johnston, Commander Evans refused to stop fighting despite catastrophic damage. His ship had lost all power. Sailors were turning the rudder by hand while Evans shouted steering orders through an open hatch. Evans ordered his gunners to engage a cruiser that was closing on the escort carrier Gambier Bay. "Draw her fire onto us and away from the carrier," Evans commanded. Johnston was hit again and again. By 9:45 a.m., she was dead in the water and sinking. Evans ordered his crew to abandon ship. As Johnston went down, a Japanese destroyer passed close aboard. The American survivors in the water watched in astonishment as a Japanese officer appeared on deck. He was saluting, saluting the ship that had fought so hard. Evans was last seen on Johnston's deck, still giving orders. His body was never recovered. He would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. But the battle wasn't over. And Halsey still hadn't answered the desperate calls for help. The messages had been flying since dawn. Admiral Kincaid had sent urgent requests for help the moment he learned Japanese battleships were attacking his escort carriers. Halsey received the messages. He was 300 miles north, closing on Ozawa's decoy carriers. Kincaid's first message arrived at 8:22 a.m., enemy battleships and cruisers attacking escort carriers. Kincaid asked Halsey to confirm that Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Halsey's staff decoded the message. The answer should have taken seconds, but Halsey delayed his response. A second message arrived at 8:29 a.m. Request immediate airstrike. A third at 9 a.m. Request Lee proceed top speed to cover Leyte. The messages grew increasingly desperate. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was following the battle through intercepted communications. He couldn't understand what was happening. Where were Halsey's battleships? At 10 a.m., Nimitz sent a message directly to Halsey. It would become the most famous naval dispatch of the war. Where is... Repeat. Where is Task Force 34? The message ended with 3 words. The world wonders. Those last 3 words were supposed to be cryptographic padding, meaningless filler that radio operators removed before delivery. But Halsey's communications officer left them in. Halsey read the message as a stinging rebuke, a public humiliation from his superior. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. He was stunned. Officers on the bridge watched Halsey's face turn white. He threw his cap on the deck in fury. Halsey stood paralyzed on his flagship's bridge. Nimitz's message had hit him like a physical blow. The world wonders. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Robert Kearney, watched Halsey stand motionless for nearly a minute. The admiral who had chased the Japanese across the Pacific was frozen. Kearney grabbed Halsey by the shoulders and shook him. "Stop it," Kearney shouted. "What the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together." But Halsey couldn't decide what to do. His fleet was closing on Ozawa's carriers, the target he had come north to destroy. Turning back now meant abandoning the attack. For almost an hour, Halsey did nothing while Taffy 3 fought for its life 300 miles to the south. His staff urged him to send his battleships back. He hesitated, he delayed, he agonized. Finally, at 11:15 a.m., Halsey ordered Task Force 34 to turn south. Admiral Lee's battleships reversed course and headed back toward San Bernardino Strait at maximum speed. They were too late. By the time Halsey made his decision, the battle off Samar was already over. Kurita had withdrawn, not because of Halsey's return. He didn't know Halsey was coming. The Japanese admiral had lost his nerve. Kurita had convinced himself he was facing a major fleet, not a handful of escort carriers. The ferocious attacks by the American destroyers had confused him. He thought he was engaging the main body of the American Third Fleet. At 9:25 a.m., with Leyte Gulf within his grasp, Kurita ordered his fleet to turn around and retreat through San Bernardino Strait. He never reached the landing beaches. The 130,000 American soldiers survived because destroyers fought like battleships and a Japanese admiral lost his nerve. Taffy 3 had survived, but the cost was staggering. 2 destroyers sunk, Johnston and Hull. 1 destroyer escort sunk, Samuel B. Roberts. 1 escort carrier, Gambier Bay, sent to the bottom by Japanese gunfire. Another, St. Lo, destroyed by the first organized kamikaze attack in history. Over 1,500 American sailors were dead or missing. Hundreds more were wounded. The survivors floated in oil-slicked waters for 2 days. They had no water, they had no shade from the tropical sun, and they were not alone. Survivors reported seeing fins cutting through the water. Men who had survived the battle were pulled under one by one, screaming for help that wasn't coming. They watched ships appear on the horizon, only to turn away because they didn't see the tiny heads bobbing in the swell. They had been abandoned twice, first by the fleet that left them unguarded, and now by the rescue ships that didn't know where to look. It was a victory that should never have been necessary. The greatest naval battle in history had been won not by careful planning, but by the suicidal courage of men in hopelessly outgunned ships. But the strategic victory didn't erase the command failure. Halsey had abandoned his post. He had chased a decoy while his own fleet was being slaughtered. The question now was what would happen to him. Admiral Ernest King was the most powerful man in the United States Navy. As Chief of Naval Operations, he answered only to the President. His word was law. In December 1944, while many of those survivors were still in burn wards, shivering from the shock of their ordeal, Halsey flew to a warm office in Washington to meet with King. Everyone in the Navy knew what was coming. The monumental blunder at Leyte had nearly caused a catastrophe. King looked at Halsey across his desk. The meeting was brief. "You got a green light on everything you did," King told him. "No reprimand, no investigation, no consequences." Halsey walked out of that office with his career not only intact, but protected at the highest level. The public never learned how close Leyte Gulf had come to disaster. The newspapers reported a great American victory. Halsey remained a national hero, the aggressive admiral who had avenged Pearl Harbor. But inside the Navy, everyone knew what had happened. Nimitz was privately furious. Kincaid had watched his escort carriers get slaughtered, while Halsey chased empty flat tops 300 miles north. The men of Taffy 3 knew most of all. They had lost friends because their cover had vanished, and nothing happened to him. The question was why. Halsey was untouchable because he was the most famous admiral in America. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Halsey had been at sea with the carrier Enterprise. He returned to find the Pacific Fleet in ruins. His reaction became legend. His most famous slogan was plastered on billboards across the Pacific. "The Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." The quote was everywhere. Newspapers printed it. Radio broadcast it. Americans who felt helpless after December 7th finally had someone who sounded like a fighter. Halsey became the face of naval vengeance. Bull Halsey, the press called him. The admiral who would make Japan pay. By 1944, his photograph had appeared on magazine covers dozens of times. He was a brand as much as a commander. Firing Halsey would have required explaining to the American public why their hero had nearly lost the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It would have meant admitting that the Navy's most aggressive admiral had been tricked by a Japanese decoy. The command structure protected him too. The Pacific War was run by two separate empires, the Navy under Nimitz and the Army under MacArthur, that barely talked to each other. Neither service wanted to give the other ammunition for post-war budget battles. MacArthur privately told his staff that Halsey should be relieved. But publicly, he defended Halsey completely. Nimitz couldn't criticize Halsey without exposing the Navy's internal conflicts. King understood all of this perfectly. The Navy needed Halsey's reputation more than it needed accountability. The public wanted heroes, not inquiries. So King gave Halsey a green light. The mistakes at Leyte Gulf would be quietly buried, but Halsey wasn't done making catastrophic decisions. 7 weeks after Leyte Gulf, Halsey sailed his fleet directly into Typhoon Cobra. It was December 17th, 1944. Weather reports had warned of a major storm forming in the Philippine Sea. Halsey's meteorologist urged him to change course. Halsey ignored them. He was focused on refueling his destroyers for upcoming operations. He refused to believe the typhoon would be as severe as predicted. He was catastrophically wrong. Typhoon Cobra struck with winds exceeding 100 knots. 3 destroyers, Hull, Monaghan, and Spence, capsized and sank. 790 sailors drowned. 146 aircraft were destroyed or swept overboard. A court of inquiry investigated. The verdict was damning. Halsey bore primary responsibility for the losses. Nimitz wrote an endorsement saying Halsey had shown gross stupidity. But Admiral King intervened again. He modified Nimitz's endorsement. He protected Halsey from formal censure. No punishment. No relief from command. 3 destroyers gone. 790 men dead. Nothing happened. Incredibly, 5 months later, he did it again. In June 1945, Halsey sailed into another typhoon off Okinawa. 6 ships were heavily damaged. The cruiser Pittsburgh had her entire bow torn off. Another court of inquiry. Another finding that placed the blame squarely on Halsey. Nimitz wanted Halsey gone, removed from command. King refused. The Navy couldn't afford the embarrassment with the war almost won. Between Leyte Gulf and the 2 typhoons, Halsey's decisions had cost the Navy 7 warships and nearly 1,500 men. And in December 1945, the Navy promoted him to Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the service. Compare Halsey's treatment to what happened to George Patton. In 1943, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. He called them cowards. He threatened to shoot them. The incidents were ugly. They violated military regulations. But no one died because of what Patton did. Patton was relieved of command for nearly a year. He was publicly humiliated. He was forced to apologize to every division in his army. His career almost ended. Halsey left an entire invasion force exposed. He ignored intelligence. He sailed blindly into 2 typhoons. He lost 7 ships and nearly 1,500 sailors through errors that courts of inquiry explicitly blamed on him. Patton slapped soldiers. Halsey got sailors killed. Patton was punished. Halsey was promoted. The difference wasn't about accountability. It was about institutional protection. King decided the Navy needed Halsey more than it needed justice. So justice was sacrificed. The men who died at Samar and in the typhoons became acceptable losses. Their deaths were quietly buried under press releases about victory and heroism. This is what institutional protection looks like. This is what happens when a man becomes too famous to punish. In 2021, explorers found the wreck of USS Johnston at 21,180 feet beneath the Philippine Sea. It was the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The hull, number 557, was still visible on her stern. Commander Ernest Evans was still down there somewhere, entombed in his ship, still on patrol at 20,000 feet. A year later, they found USS Samuel B. Roberts even deeper, 22,621 feet down. Lieutenant Commander Copeland's ship had settled into the darkness of the Philippine Trench. The men of Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation. Evans received the Medal of Honor. Their sacrifice is remembered as one of the greatest last stands in naval history. But the man who put them in that position faced no consequences. Halsey lived until 1959, celebrated as a hero. He wrote his memoirs. He appeared at ceremonies. Admiral Nimitz called the survival of Leyte Gulf nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. He was right. Taffy 3 survived because destroyers charged battleships, because escort carriers launched planes with empty bomb racks, because men like Evans and Copeland decided that if they were going to die, they would die fighting. They didn't survive because of Halsey. They survived despite him. The men of Taffy 3 answered for Halsey's mistake with their lives, and the Navy decided that was an acceptable price to pay.